Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am Amina Brown. I'm here on behalf of Data Culture to talk about our building and designing of the Vote.org impact report, but really want to focus on the challenges that we faced in trying to make it as nonpartisan as possible. So first of all, why does Vote.org need an impact report? And now, impact reports are quite common. It might seem like an obvious question, but I think it's important to consider really just the audiences that we're speaking to with this impact report and how that fits into this nonpartisan narrative. So Vote.org is a nonprofit. They obviously need donations, and this is a great way to share information about what they're doing, why the work's important, to encourage people to donate. But beyond that, it's also a huge part of their media kit. Specifically since the 2020 election, they've become much more in the public spotlight, and so there's media outlets looking for information about them, and this is a great way to showcase that. But it also means that any slip-ups are just that much more punishing. So this is actually the second impact report we've done with Vote.org. The first one was following the 2020 election, and really was much more grassroots, just talking about their work to get people to engage in democracy, get out to vote, and just discussed all sorts of ways that they were engaging the community and informing them. But moving on to 2022, they had sort of stepped up as a leader in the space. They had changed their style guidelines to reflect some of this, and that was something that played a huge impact in how we were managing these data visualization designs and the design of the overall report. And also the narrative had changed. It wasn't just about getting people to engage, but it was also talking about how engaging in democracy is really a great way to protect democracy and get people's voices heard. So that culminated in this report, which I was lucky enough to work with a great team on. So the other folks kind of in the working group were Megan Berry as our data viz designer, Angelica Home as our wonderful intern, and Mia Newman, who's the designer at Vote.org and really helped us understand exactly how to use their brand guidelines to represent their image appropriately. So some of the challenges that we were dealing with is one, just making sure that we're accurately reflecting Vote.org's mission. The second one is trying to handle color palettes without making it too partisan one way or the other. It's a very challenging thing. And then the last one is how to highlight the initiatives they're taking without putting too much bias in one direction or the other. So very briefly, the mission statement is that they use technology to simplify political engagement, increase voter turnout, and strengthen American democracy. And how this really comes to fruition is they're just encouraging people to go and vote, to know who you're voting for, and know that they can engage, and it's the best way for them to feel that they've supported democracy and really their voice is taking action. This is something that kind of permeates throughout the entire report. Every copy decision is showing us ways to reflect this. One of the most important things that we kept coming back to is Vote.org doesn't register people to vote. They give them the tools to register to vote. So it's not them pushing people in one direction or another. It's just giving them the tools to do so. And so that comes into play not just in the copy, as I mentioned, but in every decision we make with the visuals and the designs and the data that we're portraying. So the next challenge is nonpartisan color palettes. I'm sure anyone who has ever even glanced at American politics knows how ingrained colors are in that two-party system. And so while it seems obvious if you're talking about American politics, you'll use these elements of red and blue, we had to be very careful that you don't favor one more than the other or use it in the wrong way, because people will automatically make that association that, oh, it's blue, it must be Democratic, it's red, it must be Republican, and that might not be actually the takeaway we're looking to give. So the guidelines to help handle this are really that when you're using blue and red, equal parts. And then besides that, we use a lot of purple. It is, used as that middle ground, but actually their color palette is so purple, there's no white or black used in the entire report. They just have a very dark purple and a very pale purple. So an interesting thing that I personally had never worked with. But then with working with the blue and red, it was interesting when you needed to do categorical color palettes, because if you chose red for one category and it actually was a much more, there's higher distribution in that category, it would end up not being so equal of a split. And so just being really conscious of putting maybe purple first and then letting two that ended up throughout the whole visualization being about equal, handle those blue and red colors. It's just something I'd never really thought about, but was so, so important because it could be misconstrued. Now, this is an example of where color kind of changed our direction a bit. So in this visual, we were highlighting the number of voter suppression bills that were proposed since the 2020 election. And initially, we had a lot more layers to this. We talked about looking at where these bills were being proposed, so doing some sort of state-based visualization. We talked about using lots of different colors, but ultimately, those were going to misconstrue the main message, which is just that there is an overwhelming amount of these bills being proposed across the country. So that meant we removed a lot of those layers and that detail and distilled it down to just the sheer number. We used the monochromatic color palette, and then we had to play with the visual in terms of transitions and just this sort of rough stack representation to make it a little bit more interesting so that you get this impact of the visual, even though we've really boiled it down to 3 numbers. And so while that data is really talking just about data that's happening within the political sphere, Vote.org also has a lot of their own data about their own initiatives. And so we had to work really hard to highlight these initiatives without bias. And that's kind of a misnomer. Basically, it's hard to be unbiased in any means. And our bias is to show them as nonpartisan, right? So there's always some element of bias, but really we wanted to make sure that nothing we were showing indicated that they were encouraging voters to vote one way or another. So this came into play in a few different spots. I think one thing that kept coming up over and over was anytime we did state representations, we had to consider which states were there. So we obviously would sometimes do highlights and say, this is great data, we want to showcase it. And so balancing that with also having a mix of states in there. So some historically blue states, some historically red, some swing states. A good mix so that it didn't seem that they've put all their effort in, focusing on blue states or focusing on red states, when in fact it's more widespread. So even just choosing what to highlight had this underlying tone of, okay, we need to be nonpartisan and show a wide mix of things. Another kind of example of one of these initiatives was their work focusing on college campuses. So there's a lot of narrative around youth voters that the youth vote's important, but that oftentimes young people don't turn out to vote. And so Vote.org had a full initiative focused on getting out to college campuses and encouraging young people to cast their votes and really engage in democracy. We had lots of data on this, and there were a lot of layers we could have played with, talking again about the location, which colleges they were going to, whether they were HBCUs or minority institutions. But we kind of found, even after doing a lot of sort of really rough mock-ups, that adding this detail is going to draw attention away from the fact that their mission with this initiative was just to reach out to lots of young people, instead of saying, oh, they only focused in Georgia, where there were a lot of important races, or in Pennsylvania, where there were other important elections happening. So we again had to distill it, and what happens is that you end up in this situation where you say, how can we create data viz with very little data? This is a question I have talked about before, because it often happens that a client comes to you and says, hey, we have tons of data, we want to work with you, we want to build this report. But then the reality is they have a few summary stats and they say, here it is, and there's only so much you can do that's really intriguing for the user. So our sort of go to, and I'd love to chat with people after about how they handle the same situation, is to really rely on transitions and use those to approach bringing the user or the viewer in without making too many claims or having to build too many layers into the data. So basically, it's just simply reflecting. These circles are scaling to reflect the number of colleges they visited and the number of influencers they engaged, and just finding a way to make sure that there's enough space talking about the youth initiative, which was such a big part of their work, without misconstruing the data in any way. And the final piece that I want to talk about, and actually this might be the most interesting topic within the whole impact report, is what Vote.org calls their early warning system. So they have plenty of data on who's visiting the site and who's using which features on their site. And they were able to pair this with the timing of the Dobbs versus Jackson Supreme Court decision. And this decision is related to abortion rights, and so obviously is very divisive, and we had to be very careful here. So again, this is where the language comes in, and we can't, if you mention somebody being pro-choice versus pro-life, you're starting to put that partisan spin on it. So being very particular in that was important here. But also, initially we saw this, and we saw that Kansas is the most sort of impactful state on this list. They had the highest percentage increase, but also the majority of the volume of people who visited and used these tools following the decision increased so much more than the other states. So we had to be very mindful that even though Kansas was what we wanted to highlight, we need to add in those other states to not make it seem like Vote.org was somehow specifically reaching out in Kansas to influence the abortion measures that were going to be on the ballot following this Supreme Court decision. And so, again, this just changes our view and how we designed this element, but we made sure that the key takeaway throughout the 3 stages of the transition show that it really is just they have this opportunity to see that divisive topics are really kickstarting people to engage better with their democracy. And so keeping that focus on that takeaway rather than on the topic of abortion and whether it's a Republican or Democratic issue or initiative was so vital throughout this and throughout the whole piece. And with that, I want to encourage you to please explore more on the live site. And you can also explore our old report as well. But please take a look. There's so much more data and beautiful work done by the designers on the team that I wasn't able to showcase. With that, I will take questions on Slack or at the break afterwards. Thank you.